So let's talk a little bit about the traditional Denia diet. Traditionally, of course, aquatic life played a huge role. This varied a lot by location, of course. So down in Kachemak Bay, as they're called, this is from the Osgood reading, and this is, he's divided it up into Kachemak Bay, kind of Soldovia is more what he's talking about. Kenai as well as Tyonek, kind of these middle inlet or upper inlet area, kind of outer inlet areas is a way of thinking about it. Upper inlet, we're talking about kind of Anchorage, Matsu, and then Susitna, Uliamna on the other side, more inland, slightly more inland, and then Susitna kind of up closer to Anchorage, but also a little bit more inland. As we're looking at this, we see a general trend across this of less and less and less emphasis on aquatic resources, and so these are a bunch of aquatic animals that you could eat, and the X's are yes, they ate them, and the R's are sometimes they ate them. And as you can see, Kachemak Bay, Soldovia kind of area, Homer kind of area, this is going to shock no one, used tremendous amounts of aquatic resources and marine animals. And then by the time you get to places like Iliamna, which is much more inlet, you're using things like red salmon, you're using things like candlefish, but a lot of other resources are not being used. Instead, people are leaning a lot more heavily on moose hunting, caribou hunting, things like that. And then you have areas like Kenai, where a lot of these resources are being used, but you have a few things like sea lion or porpoise, which are not being used to the same degree, which is not terribly shocking given the location. So it varies by location, but overall what we see is that Dena'ina society traditionally used a lot of different types of marine resources, very much a fishing people and a marine mammal hunting people, or peoples. And you can see just kind of the vast array of species being used. 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21. That's 21 different species, and that's almost surely an undercount. Osgood was very exhaustive, but you got to think that there's still some animals that he didn't ask about. So at least 20, if not much larger, number of different animals being used by Dena'ina people. So that's pretty impressive and fascinating. Some of these animals being hunted in very interesting ways. We'll talk about that in a minute. But before I get into that, I want to introduce you to a term that's going to be a useful term. And if you're also in my cultural and ecology class, I want to apologize for the repetition. But the term is traditional ecological knowledge. Traditional ecological knowledge can be defined in a lot of different ways, but it's basically the knowledge that people have about their environment that they pass down to their children, who then expand upon it and pass it down to their children, and on and on and on ad nauseum, so long as a society continues to live in and use the same land. They keep passing on and expanding that knowledge base and adapting it over time. Fikret Berkes, a famous scholar who wrote a great book on this called Sacred Ecology, he defines it as a cumulative body of knowledge, practice, and belief. So it's not just the facts, but it's how to use the facts and how you ought to use the facts, evolving by processes and handed down through generations by cultural transmission. It can happen in a lot of ways. Overt teachings, but also things like, as we've talked about before, storytelling about the relationship of living beings, including humans, with one another and with the environment. Eugene Hun, another famous scholar in this regard, says it's the detailed, empirically and experientially grounded knowledge of local plants, animals, and places. People were doing experiments and try it out and see if it works and stuff like that long before we had sort of what we now think of as Western laboratory science. Obviously that introduced sort of new ways of thinking about experimentation and the kind of scientific method as we now think about it, but people have been doing science, experiential knowledge and empirical knowledge for thousands of years. So it's that knowledge being passed down over time. So TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge, I'll make reference to that several times in this lecture, so I just wanted to make sure you knew the term. So let's talk a little bit about, we don't have time to talk about all the different animals that were hunted and harvested, nor do I have the knowledge base to. I would like to talk a bit, though, about salmon fishing in traditional Dena'ina societies. As you read about in the Osgood reading, from which several of these images are drawn, not all of them, you had traditionally weirs, which were fish traps, right? And those could come in a number of different forms. This shows one where you've got kind of angular wooden structure, then going down into more of a triangular structure, it sort of ushers the fish into this small area, and then you'd have somebody standing in the trap area who could club the fish or otherwise get them, net them, or you could net the fish. Actually, it was really common, dip net the fishes, obviously, haul them out, and then another person would grab the fish from the first person and clean up the fish, or sorry, not clean up the fish, club the fish to make sure it was dead, and then a third guy would then string the fish on a root string, not unlike fishing lines nowadays that you would run your 5 trout along or something as you're fishing down the river. So that was one tactic, was these fishing weirs. This is showing what that looks like with this guy holding a dip net, can pass it off. You've actually got 2 guys working the net system here, and then 2 people dealing with the remains. And then you also had these more like kind of conical, almost like basket kind of things going on, where you'd have bent wood and then tie it together. Usually, a lot of times for things like that we nowadays use like rope for, a lot of times people are making it out of spruce root, which is really creative and shows a lot of traditional ecological knowledge again. So these really nice fishing structures. One of the advantages, of course, of a smaller fishing structure is that it allows a lot of escapement, as we would call it nowadays, but also at the same time, even when it's covering the whole river or waterway, you should be aware, and it probably is logically aware, that people obviously didn't have the weir running all the time. That would be terrible from a sustainability perspective, and you'd have about 1 year that would work. But instead, people would have that going for a short time, use it, and then take down the structure. So you had these weirs, or these fishing traps that people would set up in traditional areas. There's some degree of debate in the traditional, like in Osgood's ethnography, about if those fishing spots were owned by individuals or groups/clans, or just anybody could take a fishing spot that happened to be there fishing that day. It's a little bit unclear in the records. You also had these longer structures as well that people would have, and then you can spear out on this side. Spearing was used sometimes for salmon. That wasn't terribly common for all of the reasons that you would probably suspect that it wouldn't be terribly common, which is that salmon are pretty fast. I mean, they're not like speedy, like cheetah or something, but they're pretty fast. People would also use nets, which would be a combination of alder poles then tied together with spruce roots, and kind of a drag net operation. And so you would like put it out into the tidal area and then like scrape it along, have a few different people kind of pushing it along and scraping it towards the coast, pulling up fish, just like you read about in the reading. I thought it was interesting, by the way, in the reading that it talked about the fact that there's kind of this division of labor with salmon fishing. For example, one type of salmon fishing they were talking about where men would club, women would clean the fish, boys would wash the fish, and then which, the way that Osgood phrased that was funny. I think maybe he means like dress the fish and then wash the fish, right? Like, anyways. And then the elders would put up the fish to dry. He says elder males. I think other evidence would suggest that it would be elders, male or female. But anyways, that then would be a really traditional sort of division of labor. And I think it's interesting that men and women were both integrated. So were young people, at least young men, young boys, so were elders, and so multiple different people sort of being drawn into it. Halibut fishing, I thought that was really interesting. You read about that, kind of these spruce poles being used, and then a fish as bait, like a salmon being used as bait. Water comes, and it's got its guts partially spilled. Water comes in, halibut chomps on. Halibut might be strong enough to break this, but ultimately the rope is attached here at the rock, so ultimately even if your first 2 mechanisms break, you probably still hold on to the salmon because of the weight of the rock. Really impressive way to take halibut. Shows a lot of knowledge of how halibut behave, as well as their strength level, of course, and it's just generally a really creative use of the resources available at the time, long before we had things like metal fishing rods and kind of modern fishing ships. It's also a really good example of what we call the optimal foraging theory, which is I don't even know if theory is the right word. Yeah, I guess theory. Paradigm. The idea that all things being equal, a foraging group, like any other group, is going to try to maximize what they get out of the labor they put in. So people aren't dumb. In fact, hunting and gathering groups tend to be incredibly intelligent about how to use their land and not waste time and effort, right? That would be important for a lot of reasons, both from a survival perspective, and also people have other things they'd like to be doing other than just obtaining food. People would like to be back at the fire telling stories. People would like to be spending time with their kids. And so people had ways of maximizing their, I hate to say return on investments because it sounds sort of so Western capitalist, but kind of making things a more surefire, easy bet. This is a good example of that, right? You don't even have to necessarily be there. In a sense, the fish catches itself. Once you've set up the apparatus, it takes some amount of time getting it set up. But once you got it, it kind of runs itself. And you can come back during low tide and basically just watch the tide go out and then go get the halibut once the tide's gone out. And you've got a large chunk of meat, obviously. I thought the catfish tackle was really interesting too. This kind of with the cod bait being used as bait, or what he's calling a tom cod or a winter cod. And then you've got the poles and spruce root, I think, and then pulling along the bottom of the water body, which is, of course, a really smart way to catch catfish. It's kind of the only way to catch catfish in this context, and because of where they'd be kind of bottom feeders. I thought the beluga harpooning as well was really fascinating. Just to review that a little bit, that people would have a swivel harpoon with a, what do you call it? A barb on it, so it drives in, gets hooked in. After so you're on a boat, you spear the beluga, the barbed hook, I don't know why that's so hard for me to remember, but it gets stuck in there, and then it's got a thread, again probably some kind of root thread, and then a stick on the end of it. The stick's got like a, what did they use as a weight, or as a buoy? They used like a, I think it was like some kind of liver, some kind of like slightly inflatable organ, or some kind of oil. You'd use that to keep it kind of floaty, the stick. So the stick then makes, like, if I'm understanding it correctly, like water resistance, basically. At least that's the impression I got from the Osgood reading, and pulls on it. And so this beluga's having not only got a hook on its side, but it's pulling this extra water resistance because of this stick that's now running perpendicular of the water. Eventually the beluga tires itself out, and you're able to finish the beluga's life. And so beluga were another sought-after food, at least in some parts of Denia territory. As you can see, that wouldn't have been important in all areas, but especially in kind of the areas closest to Ticonderoga. And then, of course, other kinds of animals being used too. Again, I hate to just repeat the reading at you, but points that I wanted to draw out that I thought were really interesting. He talked about the clubbing of the seal method. I thought that was genius, being aware of seal behavior and the way in which they can be, well, nowadays they can be quite docile towards humans sometimes, but back then you'd have to worry about the seals kind of jumping back in the water really quick. And so instead, swimming out into the ocean, then cutting toward, like far away from the seals, then cutting towards where the seals actually are, and then approaching them from ocean side. So you're blocking off their escape route and hopefully trying to scare them the other way, and then coming up and clubbing them. Very clever adaptation to how seals would be behaving as they're sort of sunning themselves on and chilling on the beach. As well as with beaver dens, finding them via dogs, and then being able to kill the beavers. So all sorts of animals being used, and you get the sense of a group of people traditionally who were incredibly creative and using all sorts of different food resources. And there's a lot of benefits to that. Of course, it varies your diet, which nobody likes to eat one thing all the time. But perhaps more important, and it varies, of course, the types of nutrients you're getting in your body. Even different kinds of meat have different kinds of resources in them. Perhaps more importantly, I think what stands out to me is that by utilizing many food resources, you reduce the need to overuse a single food resource. Yes, salmon were used heavily, definitely kind of the key species in this regard, the staple species for a lot of Denia's villages. But interesting that so many other things were utilized other than salmon, people, and including so many different aquatic animals, right? This would have allowed for diversification of the resource base, allow you to use some of these readily available animals. Again, back to that idea of optimal foraging. If there's a nearby food animal, why go to great lengths to find the last salmon if instead you could use a much more readily available resource? But part of what that ends up doing is that you've really diversified and therefore made a much more sustainable society. You could contrast that to when a society is focused less on diversifying effort and instead on sort of consumer preferences. So off the coast of Newfoundland, they had a cod fishery. I notice I'm saying the past tense. I think they still do cod fishing there, but for a time at least, the North Atlantic cod fishery was in a specific part of Newfoundland was just in Canada was just demolished as a result of people developing better sonar and net technology that allowed them to fish and fish and fish. And as the saying goes from a famous study of this, get the last northern cod. So the cod fishery was just demolished. And so that was driven by the fact that people wanted cod on their plate, right? And so when it's consumers who don't have any connection to the food product at home driving demand, you can get to these situations where you end up killing every last individual of an animal, when instead you have a society like traditional Denia society where everybody's involved in the food production. Other kinds of priorities than just this makes great fish and chips are going to come onto the table, one of which is using many different kinds of things and not sort of using effort beyond what is needful, and that's going to often at times lead to diversification of foods, which means a more sustainable foodway. I also thought it was really interesting some of the points they made about bird use. They talked about, using certain kinds of eggs, like gull eggs, for example. I thought most interesting, though, was the eider duck. This is a beautiful bird we have here in Alaska, but they would talk about grabbing the wild chicks, and then raising them in like a little, kind of like a chicken coop, but for a duck, and then a little kind of area, and then, feeding them there and stuff, and then eventually they get big enough that you can kill them and have yourself some tasty duck. That is really fascinating because it shows kind of these blurry lines. We sometimes think of foraging as just using what's readily available, and that's true to a great degree, that it's food collecting what's already there, but there are complex ways in which foraging groups manipulate or control or influence the natural surroundings to ensure the foods of their choice more often, and this would be a good example of that. It's really interesting. Finally, I now want to talk a little bit. Actually, you know what? This is actually a good place to pause it, so I'm going to do that.